Hi YouTube, I'm Ali, welcome to the channel. Now, if you're a subscriber already, you'll probably know that I'm currently going through a bit of a house renovation. And I'm going to stick a quick picture here somewhere, so you can see exactly what's going on. But it does mean that my schedule of publishing once a week is suffering a little. But that's okay, because today, and for this week, I've got a pretty bumper-sized edition. It's an interview with a very prolific game designer, but it's a little longer than my usual interviews. So hopefully I'll be making up my lack of a weekly episode creation in that way for you. Anyway, it's full of really useful stuff, as they always are, these interviews with game designers. I'm always indebted to people who speak to me about their process, simply because there's so much that can be gleaned and learned from them. Sit tight and enjoy this week's episode if you can. Well, I must say if you can, I hope you will do. If you haven't already subscribed, please do subscribe, because it really does enthuse me to do more of this sort of stuff. And if you do like the video, this particular one, consider giving it a thumbs up too. Right, enough blurbing and just general nonsense from me. Let's crack on with the interview. Today's interviewee is someone who really does know a thing or two about game design. Not only is he a full-time game designer, but he teaches game design at university, he runs a game design studio, he owns a board game cafe, and he's a justice of the peace to boot. Now, that last one has got nothing to do with game design, but I was pretty impressed when I heard it, so I thought I'd mention it here too. The point is, this guy's got a lot going on in the world of game design, and it was an absolute joy speaking with him. Once again, I'm incredibly thankful that he gave up the time to speak to little old me. Today's interviewee is Matt Lotter, otherwise known as Matt Fantastic. Like I said, he's a prolific and award-winning game designer. And as with all of my interviews, I start by understanding how he got into the hobby, what his earliest memories are of board game design, and we go from there.
You know, obviously I played like Candyland and stuff like that, but the real thing that got me hooked was when I got to join the family D&D game.
Excellent.
And so I still have my first character sheet from 1986.
No way!
Yeah, really exciting. And you know, from there it just has been nonstop. You know, I mean, like I said, my family is into games, and in the States here, certainly in like the later 80s and into the 90s, while Germany, I can't speak to the UK as much, but games stayed in the mainstream a little bit more, as kind of like a thing that people did in a family and adults would do. Whereas, you know, when I was coming of age in the late 80s and through the 90s, it was still completely weird for adults to play games. So it was cool to have a family that I played games with all the time.
Absolutely.
So growing up in that sort of like nerdy gaming environment, you know, it obviously was a natural extension to start getting more into games. And then I just got started, you know, volunteering for companies, going to conventions, playtesting. You know, I still live just outside New York City, and I lived even closer growing up. And, you know, there were a lot of companies, a lot of things going on. You know, there were plenty of opportunities to you know, get to know people that were making moves in the industry. Zev from Z-Man is actually one of the first people who, because he's local to New York, he's one of the first people I met that was like, oh man, this guy.
Wow, yeah.
And that was early. He was still a one-man shop working out of his garage. And, you know, this was before Agricola, certainly well before pandemic. And he was just kind of like a local, smaller publisher doing cool
But now
stuff.
he's a board game rock star, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah, exactly. So that was really cool to actually see, you know, my friend explode. You know, I mean, he was already popular. He was already popular and cool before I got to know him. But you know, seeing him, you know, go through that process. You know, I did playtesting with him sometimes, and you know, watching him explode into, you know, Pandemic being what Pandemic is, and then selling the company and you know, stuff that, you know, like I remember playtesting Pandemic and being like, I don't know, Zev, I'm not really into this. So you ask, like, what gives me the authority? I'm not sure.
Now, a very quick interruption just to say a thanks again to Matt for spending time speaking to me. This is actually the longest interview I've ever had, and I've had to whittle it down to just over, I think, 40 minutes, which is less than half the amount of time we actually spent speaking with each other. So quick thanks once again. Now, back on with the interview.
Well, so obviously as a kid, you referenced it earlier, you're making all kinds of stuff, right? As a kid, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're writing, I was writing D&D stuff. I was, trying to make board games that were, pretty much like roll and move D&D. But the first game that I really remember, there's two things. First one I worked on, but first one that I remember kind of like, officially playtesting in the analog space. So I was doing you can get in digital betas pretty easily, but was Cutthroat Caverns, which is still an amazing game. Kurt is local, and he, along with Zev, are the two people that I think sort of really took me under their wing and taught me a lot about the industry and how the industry works, and are the people that kind of brought me in. And Kurt I met at a local convention, small convention, under 1,000 people, and he was playtesting Cutthroat Caverns. I think he had two releases at that point. This was before Cutthroat Caverns dropped and exploded, and I remember playing it and him being like, "Well, what do you think?" And that was just kind of a very very crazy moment to me, because I think everything before that point was, you're doing stuff, you're trying stuff, but it was more like, who knows where this is going? There's, I don't know anything, and meeting someone who was, you're a professional in the game industry. You are doing the thing, and that he cared what I thought about it was just, amazing. And shortly thereafter, I started working on a game that was called, the working title was Fairy Exterminator. Yeah, and it's something I think about going back to and trying to maybe address. It edges, or it's too close to being too edgy, trying to be too much, as opposed to just kind of goofy. It was inspired by the movie Labyrinth.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, Hago is he has that old school poison sprayer, and he's spraying the fairies, right? Because they're they bite him and whatever. And so I was like, oh, it'd be pretty funny to make a game, where the Goblin King or whoever is trying to replace the exterminator who met an untimely goblin-style demise. And so you're going around trying to kill the most fairies. It was inspired mostly by this game Grass. That came out in the early 80s. It is a pretty direct ripoff of Milliborn.
Okay.
Which, again, a really classic game, 50s, I think I want to say Milliborn came out, 50s, 60s. And this was one about selling weed. And it had a couple extra little cards and stuff, but it was pretty much just a straight ripoff. And so then I, of course, made a ripoff of a ripoff.
Right.
Where you were, instead of getting miles in Milliborn and whatever, you're, collecting the most fairy corpses, and it's going up, and you're trying to you can bank them and whatever, and it it was functional. It just wasn't even then things needed to be better, right? And I recognized that just good or functional or doing the thing isn't enough. It needs to have something, and for that one, the theme I think was still something that interests me and makes me laugh. But at the time, I just I was like, the design is great. We played it, which was amazing. It was super cool. I cut up a bunch of paper and put it in card sleeves, and we tried it, and it worked, and it didn't completely fail as a game. Fortunately, because it was pretty much just Milliborn with a couple extra things.
Now, once again, I want to stress that Matt is a prolific game designer. He's working on multiple projects at the same time, and some of them he wasn't able to describe in great detail on camera. But one of the last projects he worked on was a game called Team 3, and we chatted briefly about that here.
I'd say that, there's some stuff here and there, but the most recent kind of bigger drop is Team 3. Which came out at Essen, was the official release. Yeah, so Team 3 is one of those, and this is going to be a bad example for everyone, because it's one of those ideas that came together really, really quickly. My design partner on that came in one day to the office and said, I think it'd be really cool if we made a game about the three monkeys, the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, right? And he was thinking that maybe it was a social deduction game with limited communication, whatever, which I still think is an interesting idea. But I sort of sat there for a couple minutes and then stood up and I went and got a copy of Make and Break Extreme, which I think is out of print now, but if you can find it, it's great. It's a speed building game. You have these shapes, and you're trying to build as many structures out of these shapes as you can before the timer runs out, right? And you're flipping over these blueprint cards, and they're just telling you what to build. And it's a balance and speed thing. And it just hit me that taking that basic framework and making it so that it's the three monkeys. And so that the monkey that can't speak is the only one that can look at the plans, and the monkey that has to do the building is the monkey that can't see. And then that monkey in the middle has to translate from the visual, indicators to auditory. And so it has that kind of like real filter between it. And so it was very much kind of a lightning strike in terms of the concept. It was just kind of this is it was kind of like a variant way to play this game that I really like. And then, we kept workshopping it into where it is now. But it was we were playtesting it, 20 minutes later. We just had to round up a third person. And then, that one, it just, sometimes it just feels good.
I mean, isn't that something? Some games literally take years to produce, and yet other games like this one, like Team 3, took, 2 hours to go from initial idea to a concept that could be played? I mean, that's pretty damn fast. Now, before I get into why I think that was possible, let's chat a little with Matt about how that game actually did.
We got nominated for a Golden Geek for Best Party Game. Which we're going to lose to Wavelength, and which is fine. I mean, that's great. I don't mind.
That's a good thing to lose to, though, right?
Yeah, exactly. I saw one of your questions. We're going to get to how much I wish I had designed Wavelength, and how jealous I am of everything that he does. So we won a Golden Geek. We just won Party Game of the Year from I can't remember now. Another media outlet. Actually, I saw that like an hour ago. That we won that with
congratulations! That's awesome.
Oh, thank you.
And just to stress, Team 3 may have taken a little while to go through the full motions of being published, but to go from initial idea to concept was really, really short. Why do I think this was possible? What was allowing Matt and his design partner to be able to go from concept to a playable idea so quickly, or from idea to playable concept so quickly? It was, I think, because it was born from a wealth of knowledge from playing multiple games beforehand. Matt was able to distill out ideas that he had seen in other games and realized that with a bit of tweaking, with a bit of nuancing, they were able to kind of fit his game really well. Again, I can't stress the value of playing games beforehand whenever you think of designing your own.
I'm a huge proponent of play as many games as you can. I am not a believer in the kind of like don't spoil your brilliant ideas, because it just, you need to know what's there. It's like I'm going to make film without studying film, right? Because there's so much process, right? A lot of people are like, oh, well, some of the best painters just kind of were these outsider, self-taught, doing weird stuff. The problem is that game design is also a technical process, and so there is, it's interesting in that it's very multidisciplinary, and that you have to have this kind of creative spark and this kind of outside the box and doing this and that. But especially when you get into the more development side of taking that idea into a finished product, that's a much more technical process. And so I put that closer to like, say, like a photography or a film thing, where you might have this great idea, you might have this great vision, you might have all these amazing things, but if you don't know how to properly expose film, you don't know like what an f-stop is, like you're not gonna be as successful, because you're not gonna necessarily be able to get your vision to be realized. And so game design is very similar in a lot of ways, right? A lot of a lot of design comes from this kind of experiential place, which is my primary sort of motivator, right? I mean, I come at it from different angles, but experiential is usually where it comes from. I want everybody sitting around the table staring at each other and not knowing who to trust. I want, whatever it is, right? And so I have this play experience that I want to have happen, and the technical side is taking that concept and being able to use the building blocks that we have in game design and the theory that we've read and all of this work that's been done to establish these paradigms, these concepts, all this stuff that exists in the space. And then we can take that and be able to more fully realize what it is that we actually want to have happening. Most designers that I see a lot of designers, especially my students, have this really cool idea, have this concept. Maybe it's just an elevator pitch, and they it can be varying degrees, but the biggest problem they run into is it doesn't do the stuff they want it to, right? They have this thing and they just can't make it do the thing they want it to. So there's a lot of, well, yeah, but like, why did you make this like roll and move, right? Or why is this an auction? That doesn't make sense here. And it's like, oh, I don't know. You needed to get these things, right? And it's like, oh, well, why don't you try, X, Y, Z? Game design, especially, I think, from in a silo of a single design is such a hugely iterative process, but just design in general is a hugely iterative process, and being aware of what came before is crucial, right? I mean, one of the worst things that I'll see is I'll be at an event or do something and I'll see somebody that's worked pretty hard at making something, put a lot of time and effort in, and then I'm just like, I don't really know how to tell you this, but like, this is just kind of like a crappier version of this other game that's been out. It came out 15 years ago. It's one of these kind of things. I get joked about with some of my design partners and people in the design groups that I'm like the dream killer, because people come to me with these ideas and they do the thing and I'm just like, oh, that's great, except like XYZ already did it like 20 years ago and it's perfect. So you need to go even a further step. Like, this isn't original. I think that's that's one of the biggest things with creativity, right?
Okay, so setting aside the idea of having experience of playing lots of games, what else can help us in ensuring the game we're trying to produce is the best it possibly can be?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think it's the most important thing about game design, and now I'm going to get very conceptual here, is having a vision of what it is that you're trying to do. You need to be open to that vision changing and adjusting, and you're getting feedback from the thing you're doing. But if you don't have a clear concept of what it is you're trying to do, you have nothing to gauge the success against. You have no way to look at the different facets of game design and how to support what that vision is, right? So, sometimes people do come in at mechanics first, right? I have this incredible idea for this sort of like mechanical procedural element of a game design, right? And that's great, but then you want people to play it and enjoy it, right? So maybe you need to be looking at other games, doing market research, doing trend analysis. If you want to get really, higher tier on it, pirates are not in anymore. So like, what else? What are you going to do, right? So looking at whichever element it is, or whichever elements it is that you need to adjust and bring in to help create that vision. Having that vision is how you're going to be able to assess those different elements. And again, playing lots of games is going to give you the opportunity to see not only what works, what doesn't, but also completely different perspectives on how to solve problems. Right? Because ultimately, we're trying to solve the problem of creating this experience, this vision that we have. And the problem is, how do we get that to happen? How do we get that to happen more and the best that it can?
Now, I'm just going to take a quick second out here to talk about the reuse of mechanics, because it's been mentioned over and over again. I want to stress, as I always do, this is not about taking existing mechanics and just reskinning the game, in effect copying it, but with maybe a slight alteration. This is about taking the core of some mechanics, tweaking them, nuancing them, making them your own, adding your own value to it, and realizing that it would fit your particular game. I am distinguishing between just plagiarizing an existing game with maybe a very obvious reskin to actually taking the core elements of a game and repurposing them in appropriate ways to fit your game. I think Matt summed it up very well.
You know, I mean, if you think about music, right? There are how many notes, right?
Yeah.
There are how many chords? And I mean, there's a good number. But
Yeah.
ultimately, like, if you think that like somebody hasn't already done that chord progression, like you're
wrong.
very wrong.
Someone's done
right?
it, yeah.
Okay, back with the interview. Let's talk about playtesting. What were Matt's views on that?
I think the key there is that you go into different types of playtesting with different expectations and different goals, and that each of them serves a really valuable purpose. And you know, some of them are obviously more relevant later in the process. Some of them are more relevant earlier in the process. I myself am fortunate enough to be a full-time designer, to have an office the creative, you know, for my creative studio. And there are a number of people that you know, I collaborate with that are in that office. I also own you know, game cafe, game shop kind of situation. So there's constantly people there. I also run the New Haven Game Makers Guild, which is our sort of local playtesting professional kind of doing stuff organization. And so I am spoiled with playtesters, and I can playtest kind of whenever I feel like it. And so for me, I have that built in. You know, as soon as I have something, it's like, hey, like whatever you were doing, let's do this for 10 minutes. You know, let's spend 20 minutes on this. You know, I'll frequently come up with an idea and be able to playtest that same day, certainly that same week. You know, getting stuff happening. And so, so for people that don't have that, I think that you still want to leverage that friends and family. Other designers are the absolute best if you have a local group, because, you know, for me, I have no qualms about bringing absolute untested garbage. The real key to that is not wasting people's time and being accepting and recognizing, like, oh, this went totally off the rails. It's 5 minutes in, and like, I'm gonna put it away, right? Like this didn't do what I wanted. It's not playing it out. It's not like, well, let's go all the way. Let's, you know, I really want to, you know, if it's not working, it's not working. Put it away. Do something else. But creating that environment of try, fail, try iteration is crucial, especially to newer designers, because you're going to look at each other. You can look at each other's stuff, right? You can bring me absolute garbage and I'll look at it, because I'm going to bring you some absolute garbage next week. And eventually this stuff's going to come together. And we all, as designers, whether we're completely new, seasoned veterans, whatever, we all know that we can't design in a vacuum. And we are reliant on our peers, whether those are people that work for us, people we work for, people that we just know through the community. And something that I think is the most exciting about what's gone on in terms of sort of like the digital world and you know, connecting and creating groups, is that everyone, to some degree, everyone with a few kind of like totally out there exceptions, is at least relatively close to a group of other designers. You know, and if there isn't, you can probably start one, and within a month, you'll have at least 2 or 3 other people that you can sit down and play each other's garbage with before you start subjecting people that are not designers. That's actually, I think, the best first step is other designers, because we are the most forgiving, we're the most understanding. We also have the most ability early on to say, oh, this is like this is like that. Have you thought about this?
Now, in that response, Matt did touch upon it, but what if we, as mere mortals, don't have access to that many people? How can we find the right people to go and test our games?
I think the internet is a wonderful resource in that way. We can put a pin in. I can complain about the internet as well, and what the digital design community has fallen short with, in my opinion. But you go on Facebook, or you go on Board Game Geek, or you go to regional convention. I guarantee that if you go to UK Games Expo, you will find people that are relatively close to you, and especially in the UK. I mean, you're like 2 hours from anywhere, right? Like.
It's true. It's tiny.
To some degree, you may have to put in a little bit of extra effort, but I think most people will be surprised at the fact that there are already people doing this, like, close to you. And if there aren't, you should A, start your group, and B, maybe you have to start traveling to places. Which, again, another side thing I want to get into is that it is a grind, and you got to put in the work. And if you just want to have this hobby, doing the thing, well, that's great, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that's fun. But I liken that to being in like a bar band, right? Like, it's super fun to go out and play music. You love the experience, but you're not going to get rich. You're not trying to make a career out of it. You just want to get together with your buddies, play some music, practice. You want to do your weekly practice, get together, and then once in a while you want to play out, and that is your weekly playtest group, and once in a while you'll go to a convention, do whatever. Then you have these kind of mid-tier situations where you're sort of like a working band, but you're like maybe a wedding band, or you're doing stuff and you're working, and it's on that semi-career path, but you're making real money. And then you get to people that are full-time doing the thing, and that is A, tough to get to, and B, a brutal grind to get there, and C, the kind of thing that you need to be making sacrifices for in most cases, to get to that place. So in terms of finding a group to play with, my question, or I guess my first question is, how serious are you? And everybody, no, there's not a single person anywhere who's going to say, well, like, it would be terrible if I was successful and people liked the thing I made, right? But having realistic expectations of, no, I have a life, I have a family, I have a career. This is a fun, interesting hobby to me, and sometimes you can make brilliant work. Like, don't get me wrong that it's not a question of quality of work, but it's a question of dedication, right? People get really tied to this one. Are you tied to this one idea, or are you already 6 ideas ahead? And this one idea is just like, if it goes, it goes. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But then you have the people that have worked on the same thing for years and whatever, and you're going to approach things very differently, right? For me, if something doesn't work, it doesn't work. I just do another thing.
Okay, so what advice would Matt give us for approaching someone to playtest? And is there anyone we should be avoiding when it comes to playtesting?
The absolute worst person is also probably a game designer. And it is the game designer who wants to tell you how to fix all the problems in your game. It is a game designer who wants to bring their own ideas about what is and isn't good to playtesting your game. It is someone who wants to, the counterpoint to that, some of it is easier to explain as what is good about it, is someone who comes to the game with a clear understanding, and this is partly on you as the designer, to give a clear goal for the playtest, right? Is it fun? I don't care. We can get to that in a sec. But like, I really want to make sure that the movement in this works. So some of the stuff, the combat is not interesting. That's fine. But how does movement work? And we'll just, roll D6s and see who rolls higher, and we'll just take that. It's not interesting. Trust me, it's not interesting. But movement, let's focus on that. Or, this is a pre-alpha. Does it work at all, right? And then also approaching the designer with questions before you give answers. What is it you want out of the test is a big one, but also what kind of feedback do you want? What are you looking for specifically out of this? Which, also has the knock-on effect of forcing designers to be able to answer those questions, which I think is a hugely important thing for clarifying what it is that you're spending your time on. But, so game designers are simultaneously the best and the worst. I'll paraphrase Neil Gaiman, and an excellent quote that I talk about all the time, that he made about writing, which is that if someone tells you they don't like something, that something's wrong, they are probably right. If they tell you how to fix it, they are probably wrong. So designers can be the best and the worst. And frequently it's a blend of both. And I think we are all guilty of getting too excited about someone else's idea and feel, like blah, 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 spitting out ideas. And we all strive to, dial it back, because when you're playtesting something, it is 100% about that person and their project. It is completely selfless. What you are getting out of it is, development of skill. You're getting plenty out of it in terms of your just honing your skills, practicing your skills, building your practice. But ultimately, it is for that other person. And so you want to be able to approach it and give people useful, actionable information that jibes with what it is that they want to find out, right?
Now, obviously, in the year 2020, the pandemic is rife still in many places, and meeting people face-to-face isn't always possible, which means that there's a greater reliance perhaps on some of the online or digital playtesting mechanisms that are out there. What did Matt think about using those? Do they have value?
I have very strong opinions about this. As someone who is full-time, I teach, and I am teaching an online section, which I did for the first time last semester. But my sort of like the short of my opinion is that digital testing is perfectly serviceable for certain types of testing. It can be immensely useful, especially when you're looking at sort of like bulk testing, larger scale sort of edge case, poking around for edge cases, kind of looking to see sort of curves and trends within the math, for example, where you need more, you're a scientist, right? The more data points you have, the more confident you are and the more able to look for patterns you are, right? And so testing of that nature, I think you can absolutely do remotely. I think it's great. But for me, part of this is going to get at little asterisks that the types of games I tend to design, the types of games that interest me are ones where the physical space that we are in is tied to the gameplay, whether that is, a dexterity type element or like a Twilight Imperium or diplomacy, right? Diplomacy, I love playing diplomacy online, but it also is very different than when I'm like, hey man, like let's go over there and we're gonna have a little conference, and I'm gonna, the tone of voice, the way that you present there's so many things about being human and the way that we communicate and interact that you lose, I guess is the real short on that, is that it's to me, it's like testing like medication on rats, right? You can find out some very important information. Like you can absolutely, like, I mean, I'm actually kind of against animal testing, but we'll set that aside and say that you can. I will not deny that there is useful information that is gleaned from these processes, right? That said, like just because you're like, yeah, well, this worked on a rat doesn't mean that you're just like, okay, great, we'll give it to humans, like approved, right? So it's very similar to that in that you can get a lot of great information from it, and obviously certain types of games are going to be better or worse suited to that. But even a game like Ascension, which I think is a brilliant design, I think Justin is super talented. The World of Warcraft minis game, if you have never played it, is absolutely criminally underrated at how amazing it is. But there's a new Ascension minis game coming out that I'll plug briefly for that. So Ascension is a deck builder, for people that don't know it. It's a deck builder. It's sort of like a math-heavy kind of systems-driven approach. Justin was a professional Magic player for years, and it is very procedural. And so as an app, it works incredibly well. I'm at the point where I will only play it as an app because I'm lazy about shuffling, but I've also played it hundreds of times at this point, thanks to it being an app that I can just crank through, right? But I feel like playing it in person, especially during that testing phase, there's a lot of information that would be missing if it was purely digital, right? So a lot of stuff that, for example, is like how are other people looking at their phones during downtime? Are people engaged in other people's turns? Are people sort of wandering off? What's their attention like? What is the environment in which you are in, right? A lot of these digital things, especially you don't have video, right? So like, I don't know, you could be like eating a sandwich and doing this and somebody's over there and you just have it on mute and well, I don't know how you're interacting with the system. I don't know if you're doing poorly because you didn't understand, you're making this stupid move because you didn't understand something, or you just because you like, oh shit, I wasn't paying attention, my bad. So there are things that I think Ascension benefited from greatly during its testing process as related to that face-to-face experience. Even in a game where it is something that lends itself very well to that digital space. If you're making a digital game, like great, make a digital game. And I think there are definitely, things that really bridge that divide. But to me, I'm a big proponent of works of art and media that do something intrinsic to the medium itself. So for example, Alan Moore. I don't know if you're into comics at all.
Yeah.
Starting with Swamp Thing, and then I think Watchmen is kind of the perfect example, where you have, and I'll use that because most people know it, you have the dossiers at the end of each issue. You have the story within a story of the Black Freighter. You have all of these elements that work in the comic medium. And whatever your opinion is of the movie or the show, and I will say that I adore the show, but there's something intrinsic to the show that they were able to do that you couldn't do in that comic medium, right? But in the comic medium, you can't do that kind of. They didn't do the Black Freighter in any of the adaptations of Watchmen because it doesn't work, right? It doesn't do the same thing. Even if you're doing like character exposition to get through some of the stuff in the dossiers, it's not the same as flipping through pages that look like, Rorschach's notes or whatever, right? Like there's something tied to that medium. And so in the tabletop gaming space, there's a reason that we're tabletop designers. And there's a whole bunch, but one of them to me that is super important is that we want to exist in this physical space. We want to play a game sitting around a table from each other. And there are games where the design goal is, here's the thing to kind of half mindlessly do while we're drinking beers and hanging out and doing whatever, right? Like Liar's Dice, right? Like Liar Dice is or Perudo or whatever you want to call it. A brilliant, amazing game, but I'm not going to sit down and like focus and play it for 5 hours. That said, I could play it for 5 hours if we're hanging out in the bar and drinking, and we take 15-minute break over here, and then somebody has to go get a cigarette. You do it, but all of a sudden it's 5 hours later, and we've been playing Liar's Dice for 5 hours, right? And all of this is tied to that physical space and what is intrinsic to being face to face to somebody.
By this stage, we'd been speaking together for maybe an hour and a half. Honestly, the time flew by. It was absolutely awesome. Okay, enough of that. It was good though. The point is, I wanted to just touch upon rules because it was something that he mentioned a couple of times, and he kind of skirted around the subject. Now, I come from a background where I thought rules, having a clear set of rules when you go into playtesting was really important. Matt, however, didn't quite see eye to eye with me on that.
I disagree. So I think that it is super important to have a document. I refer to it as a workbook. Some people call them scratch pads, whatever. So I will, when I start a new design and I'm actually like moving beyond just kind of the raw concept stage, I start a Google document, and it is called whatever the project is, which may be a complete, like mechanic, placeholder, whatever, workbook. And that is where I just info dump everything, thoughts, sometimes, sections, whatever. It is something that I can use to recreate what I have going on, what my thought process is, what's good, what's bad, but it's something that I can play from, right? If I haven't touched it for 6 months, I should be able to look at this and have a general idea of what it is that we're doing. Writing rules is an incredibly formal process, and one that I think comes much later in the process. I frequently, I'd say probably 90% of the couple dozen games that I have designed, development's a whole different side, rules were written after the game was signed. I pitched the game as, this is the game, we're going to play it, and people really liked it. Frequently, rules will get written after a publisher takes it and has played it and is like, yes, we really want to play this more. Can you give us the rules so that we can play it wherever? But again, those rules are not great rules necessarily. I like to think that I'm okay at it after having done it for a while, but the rules that I write for beta testing are going to be different. And this is before we're doing blind testing. So blind testing, we're going to say, is another phase where blind testing is specifically testing the rules. That's it. Your game needs to be done and working before you start blind testing, because blind testing is not a question of, is the game good? Blind testing is a question of, is your expression of the rules reasonable? There's a couple other little things there that you're going to get in blind testing in terms of intuitive design or something, which is a whole much larger conversation. But ultimately, I don't need other people to be able to play from a document, because that is a whole huge can of worms. And people that are good at writing rules are incredibly talented. And I mean, we've all played games that we thought were amazing, and you read the rule and you're like, this isn't even the game I played, right? Like, you get taught a game and then you go look at the rules later and you're like, oh, we'll play it with everybody. And you're like, if I was just reading this, I wouldn't even know where to begin, right?
Absolutely.
And the game can be, and those are people that are serious professionals, I don't want to name names, but there are companies that are huge that will put out rule books that are complete disasters.
Now, just to emphasize what I think Matt is saying here, he's not saying that rules are not important. He's saying formalizing the rules into a set of readable rules that can be, that express those ideas, as he mentions, that happens much later. So get the game out, get it tested, explain it verbally perhaps, but actually producing a formal rule book, well, that's something for much later.
When I say you don't need to write the rules, I think of the rules as a formal document that you can sit down and play the game from. We may, in a much more complicated, larger rulebook situation, do that section by section, right? So if we talk about, like, let's say D&D or an RPG, right? We may have the rules for character creation before we have a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And so we may test portions of the rules as written before we have necessarily, you can play the whole game from this rulebook, but ultimately, rules are a way to transmit information, right? And this is one of the major shortcomings or difficult bits about that analog space, is that in a digital game, the rules are enforced for you, right? We're playing a first-person game. You can't walk through a wall, right? You just can't do it. The game itself enforces the core rules of the system, right? Well, we're playing, a dungeon crawl. Like, well, I don't know. I'm a ghost. I could probably walk through that wall, right? And like, well, I don't know. I couldn't figure it out. And the rule, sure, you can kick down the wall. Great, right? There's nothing to, we as designers are not there saying like, you did that wrong. Whoop, you did that wrong, right? And so rules are expressly there to transmit ideas. It's 100% just a communication tool. Rules, well-written rules, make it all feel so obvious. They make it so that what you don't remember, you remember most of it, and then what you don't remember, you can easily reference. And there's so many things that go into writing rules. There are people. You think about people who have entire degrees in copy editing, right? That is what they do. Is they write copy, they edit copy, they work with language, and people with some amount of expertise there are going to do a better job than me. I try to turn in rules that are very functional. I work with some publishers where I am ultimately the one who writes the rules. But like Stoner Parking Lot, for example, because we just went through this process, I had a rules document. Like I said, the one that was looked like a flyer. So I had this rules document. It worked. People could play the game. But Mondo is a bigger company, and they have people whose job it is to write copy. Advertising, whatever, and they had, there were a couple people on the Mondo team that collaborated with me to finalize the actual rules. They went in. I have in our studio we have like a part-time. I think he is in the same office. He rents the space from the office, but he's not like a full-time employee. But he is a copywriter. He works in advertising primarily, and just game design stuff too. But he helps with rulebooks. And thinking about writing for clarity, technical writing is you're in the sciences, right? We've all read like a textbook or a technical document that is just like, this probably says the thing, but what? And then we've read other ones. We've read other ones where it's the most academic of writing, but it illuminates the subject, and you're just like, oh my God, like the writing reaches a level that you now have a deeper understanding of like the core of what it is. And so, having someone who is a professional writer, at the very least, do light editing for clarity, for making sure like, hey, you know what? Actually, you should put a comma here and then do this. And, that will, let's move this sentence here. Let's take this. And you have this in one sentence. We should split it into three. And, like all of that kind of really technical aspects are what make a set of rules really sing, right? And so as the designer, we want to write good rules. But ultimately, we want to lean on someone whose job it is to work with words, to really, really nail that.
So as I entered the final segment of my interview, I thought I'd close things down by asking my cliche yet time-honored question, which is, if you had one piece of advice to give a budding game designer, what exactly would it be?
I have like maybe a couple, so I'm going to kind of like try to put those together into one, which is this kind of combination of having a clear idea and being honest with yourself about what it is that you want out of designing games, and then looking and taking a very hard look at the process to get to where it is that you realistically want to be, right? Like I said before, everybody wants to be, the next, Kinesia, right? Everybody wants to be Bruno Faiduti. Like everybody wants to be Eric Lang, right? But realistically, are you willing to make these sacrifices, this commitment to do these things? In some cases, right, like something that comes up a lot for me is I don't have kids. I'm never going to have kids. I don't care about money in a major way. Like I have to live or whatever, but that affords me the opportunity to not make a lot of money, especially earlier on in my career, where I could just hustle it up, and I was comfortable, grinding it out. I came up, touring in punk bands, and so when it was, hey, Wizards of the Coast will put you up in a hotel room with 4 other people, and you can sleep on the floor, and they'll get your meals, and you can come work all weekend. It was like, okay, cool, doing it, right? And I don't want to get into exploitative labor practices or whatever, and the changing paradigm that's happened now, which I think is definitely good. But for me, it was this grind, right? So it's taking a realistic look at what you want out of it and the sacrifices that are required to get to where you want to be, and recognizing what you are and are not willing to do, right? To get there. And then, like everybody wants to do of course, right? I'd also love to be the Queen of England, right? But like, it's just not for me, right?
Well, folks, here we are at the end of the interview. Yet another inspirational, informative, and I think entertaining interview. I want to say a huge heartfelt thanks to Matt for spending time with me. It was really, really was a really pleasurable experience. Matt was genuinely so full of knowledge and infectious passion for game design. It was hard not to carry on speaking with him. We literally could have chatted till the wee hours of the night. Anyway, the point is, we're at the end, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you have, please do give it a thumbs up. If you like this kind of content and want to see more, try subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you get informed of when the next video comes out. Like I said, there's a little bit of a hiatus in getting out information, videos to you guys at the moment because of this building work. I will get through it. It's just a matter of a few more weeks, and then we'll be back to our scheduled regular slot. But in the meantime, enjoy the back catalogue of stuff. If you want to hear about anything specific, drop me a comment below. I do read my comments and I do respond to them. So have a look through, see if there's anything you want to know about, a bit more about, and I'll be on the case. Now, very shortly, I've got an interview coming up with someone I'm really excited to speak about. And we're not going to be talking about game design necessarily. We're going to be talking about the future of the industry, the future of the hobby, and how we can improve it as game designers as well as players. So I won't say much more than that, but look forward to that in the coming weeks. Okay, guys, take care.